The twins' cries carried clear across the yard at Frost Hollow, thin and hoarse and desperate. The sound of two small creatures who had been crying so long they'd nearly worn the crying out of themselves. And Delphine Marsh set down her mending and was on her feet, and moving toward the sound before she'd given herself leave to go. She found Marcus Ingalls standing in the middle of his own kitchen looking like a man who had been handed a burning coal and told to hold it forever. Two infants, no bigger than loaves of bread, lay squalling in a basket on the table, their small faces red and furious, and a jar of watered cow's milk sat abandoned and curdling beside them, refused, useless. A father's best effort proved not nearly enough. "They won't take the milk," he said, and his voice cracked on it in a way that told her this proud, silent man had already been undone once today and was fighting not to be undone twice. 3 days since Eliza passed, and I can't get either one of them to stop crying long enough to sleep, and I don't." He stopped, looked at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else. "I don't know what a man does, Mrs. Marsh, when his children are starving in front of him, and there's nothing in the house that will feed them." Delphine knew exactly what a man did, because she knew what a woman did too, standing helpless before a hunger she could not fill. She had stood in that same place herself, not 4 months past, in a soddy 2 miles east, with a baby of her own who had come too early and stayed too briefly, and she had learned in the worst possible way that love was not always enough to keep a small heart beating. She should have said as much and gone home. Instead, she found herself crossing the kitchen, lifting the nearer twin from the basket, feeling the desperate, rooting hunger of the small mouth against her shoulder, and something old and aching and long-dammed broke open in her chest. "I can nurse them," she said, before she had fully decided to say it, before she had let herself feel the size of what she was offering. "My milk came in for my own girl and it hasn't gone yet. I can nurse them, Mr. Ingalls, if you'll allow it." She had buried her daughter in a small box her husband's brother had built the week before he too succumbed to the same fever that had carried off half the county that spring, so that within a month Delphine had gone from wife and mother to widow and mourner of an empty cradle. All in the space of time it took the wildflowers to bloom and fade along the creek bottom. She had told herself in the raw weeks after that her body's stubborn insistence on producing milk for a child no longer living was the cruelest trick grief had played on her yet, a daily reminder wrapped in physical ache. She had wept into her pillow more nights than she could count, cursing a body that would not simply let her forget. Standing now in Marcus Ingalls's kitchen with his daughter's hungry mouth finding her breast at last, she understood for the first time that the cruelty might have been mercy in disguise all along, waiting only for a hunger worth answering. Marcus Ingalls had buried a wife 3 days past, and he did not know in that moment whether the offer standing in his kitchen was mercy or torment. He knew Delphine Marsh's story the way the whole of Frost Hollow knew it, the fever that had taken her husband, the baby girl who had come at 7 months and lived not quite a week, the young widow who had gone quiet and gray afterward and kept to her house and her mending, and did not, by all accounts, welcome visitors or comfort. He had not expected her at his door. He had certainly not expected her to offer the one thing his own dead wife could no longer give. He remembered Eliza in those first raw hours only in fragments, the sound of her labored breathing in the small back bedroom, the midwife's grim face in the doorway, the terrible silence that had followed the birth of 2 healthy daughters and the death of the woman who bore them, a cruelty of timing he did not think he would ever make peace with. He had held his wife's hand until it went cold, and then he had gone out to the porch and stood in the freezing dark for the better part of an hour, unable to go back inside to the sound of his daughter's crying, because he did not know, in that moment, how a man was meant to be father and mother both to 2 children who had already lost everything else in the world worth keeping. "You do that," he said slowly, "after what it cost you to have milk in the first place, with no baby of your own left to give it to." Something flickered across her face, quick and raw, gone before he could be sure he'd seen it. "I have milk and no daughter to feed it to," she said. "You have daughters and no way to feed them. It doesn't strike me as complicated, Mr. Ingalls, only sad, and I've had my fill of sad without adding a starved child to the count of it. He should have refused out of pride. He very nearly did. But the twin in her arms had gone quiet, working steadily now, small fists uncurling against her collar, and the sound of that quiet, the first quiet the house had known in 3 days, undid whatever objection he'd been building. "Then I'm obliged to you," he said, "more than I know how to say properly." And he meant it so completely that his voice failed him partway through, and he had to turn toward the window and busy himself with nothing at all until he trusted it again. She came every morning after that, and every evening too, walking the 2 miles between her soddy and his ranch house with her shawl pulled tight against the autumn chill, and each time she lifted one twin, and then the other to her breast she felt the strange, aching mercy of it, a grief being put, however briefly, to some use. She had thought her body's milk a cruel joke left over from a life that hadn't happened, evidence of a daughter she would spend the rest of her days missing. She had not expected it to become, instead, a bridge back into the world of the living. The twins she named privately for herself, though their father had not yet settled on names of his own in the fog of his grief. The elder, quieter one she called Grace, for the small mercy of her survival, and the younger, more fretful one she called Hope, because some days that was the only word large enough for what she felt watching them thrive. It was not long before the arrangement drew talk in town, as such things always did in a place small enough that every wagon track was noticed and accounted for. Delphine felt the weight of it the first Sunday she walked into church and found 2 of the deacons' wives leaning their heads together, their eyes sliding to her and away again, with the particular swiftness of women discussing something they'd rather not be caught discussing. "A widow walking to a widower's house morning and night," one of them murmured, not quite low enough. "Whatever will people think?" "Let them think what they like," Delphine said aloud, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice, "so long as 2 motherless babies are fed and warm while they're thinking it." She held the older woman's gaze until it was the woman who looked away first, and walked on to her pew with her chin level, though her hands trembled in her lap through the whole of the sermon. She did not tell Marcus about the whispering, not wanting to burden a grieving man with gossip he could do nothing to silence, but he heard of it soon enough from his own foreman, and the next Sunday he walked into church beside her, plain as anything, and sat with his daughters in the pew directly behind her family's old seat, so that no one in Frost Hollow could mistake where his loyalties lay. It was a small thing, a matter of a few feet of pew and an hour of his time, but Delphine felt it settle over her like a shawl against the cold, and the whispering, deprived of the scandal it wanted, thinned to almost nothing within a month. Marcus noticed the names on her lips before she meant him to hear them, one gray November evening while she rocked Hope by the fire and hummed some tune too soft to place. He had not named the girls himself. He had not been able to. Every name he considered felt like carving something permanent into a loss too fresh to bear looking at directly. "Grace and Hope," he said from the doorway, and she startled, caught out, color rising in her tired face. "I didn't mean to overhear." "I'm sorry. It isn't my place to name your daughters, Mr. Ingalls. I only—" She looked down at the baby in her arms, and her voice thinned. "I only wanted them to have names that meant something good, since so much of what brought them into this world was sorrow." He crossed the kitchen and looked down at his daughters, one at Delphine's breast, one asleep in the basket, both of them pink-cheeked and quiet where 3 days before they had been hoarse and gray with hunger, and felt something settle in his chest that had not settled since Eliza's last breath. "Grace and Hope," he said again, testing the words, and found them good. "I believe those are exactly the names they were meant to carry, Mrs. Marsh. I believe you gave them something I couldn't find in myself to give." Winter closed hard over Frost Hollow that year, snow piling deep against the fence lines, and still Delphine came, some mornings wading through drifts to her knees, because the twins' hunger did not pause for weather, and neither, she found, did the tenderness that had grown quietly alongside it. She watched Marcus with his daughters in the evenings, clumsy and devoted, learning to swaddle and soothe and rock with the same stubborn will he must have once brought to breaking horses, and she found herself watching him rather than the twins more often than she meant to admit. He, in turn, had begun to watch for her at the window before she was due, and to notice the particular sound of her step on the porch boards, and to feel a hollow disappointment on the rare evenings weather kept her home. He told himself it was only gratitude. He told himself that for longer than was strictly honest. There was an evening in December when the roads iced over so badly that Delphine did not come at all, and Marcus spent the whole of it pacing between the window and the crying basket, trying and failing to coax the twins into taking watered milk from a spoon. Until near midnight he could stand it no longer and saddled his horse against his own better judgment, riding the 2 miles to Hoarse through a sleeting dark that could easily have broken a leg or worse. He found her awake by her small stove, unable to sleep herself for worry over the girls, and when he asked her plainly to simply stay at the ranch house through the worst of the winter rather than risk the walk twice daily, she did not answer for a long moment. "It isn't proper," she said finally, though there was no real conviction in it. "Neither is starving 2 babies rather than bend to what's proper," he said. "I'll have my sister's girl come stay as chaperone if it eases your mind, Delphine, but I'd have you safe under my roof through the hard months, and I'd have my daughters fed without you risking your neck on ice to do it." She agreed in the end, and his young niece came to keep the appearance of things respectable, though both Marcus and Delphine understood well enough that propriety was no longer the true shape of what was growing between them in that quiet house. He took to sitting with her by the fire after the twins were down, not speaking much at first, simply present, and then speaking more as the weeks wore on of Eliza, of his own boyhood, of the dry seasons that had nearly broken the ranch before the twins were even born. She told him, in turn, of her husband, of the daughter she had lost, of the particular loneliness of a house gone silent after holding, however briefly, the sound of a baby's breathing. "I did not think I would ever want to hear a child cry again," she admitted one night, watching the fire rather than his face. "I thought every cry would only remind me of the one I couldn't save, but your daughter's crying doesn't hurt me anymore, Marcus. It only makes me want to run to them." "That," he said quietly, "is the kindest thing grief has ever done for either of us." It was Grace who forced the truth of it into the open in the deep cold of January, when a fever took hold of her small body so suddenly and so fiercely that Delphine, arriving at dusk, found Marcus pacing the kitchen with the baby limp and burning against his shoulder, his composure finally, completely gone. "She won't nurse," he said, and his voice had the same raw edge it had carried that first terrible day. "She won't take anything, Delphine, and her breathing's gone so shallow, and I've already lost. I can't lose her too. I can't." Delphine did not waste time on words. She took Grace from his arms, stripped the swaddling to cool the small burning body, sponged her with melted snow water while Marcus held the lamp with hands that shook, and settled into the long, terrible vigil she remembered too well from her own daughter's brief life. Except this time she refused, with a fierceness that surprised her, to let the ending be the same. Through the worst of the night she coaxed sips of milk and water into the baby a drop at a time, sang low and steady the same wordless tune she'd hummed by the fire, and did not once let herself think the thought that kept rising at the edges of her mind, that she could not survive burying a second child, even one that was not, by blood, her own. Near dawn, with the fever finally breaking and Grace's breathing easing into something deep and even against her chest, Delphine looked up to find Marcus watching her with an expression she had no name for, something between awe and a grief so old it had become tenderness. "You fought for her all night like she was your own," he said quietly. "She is mine," Delphine said, and heard the truth of it land in the room before she'd fully understood she meant to say it. "Not by blood, but I have loved her since the first hour she took milk from me, Marcus, and I have loved her sister just as fierce, and I think," her voice broke and she let it, "I think I have loved their father a good while too, though I've been too afraid of losing anything else to say so." He crossed the small distance between them slowly, as though she might startle and vanish, and knelt beside her chair, his hand coming to rest over both of theirs where they cradled his sleeping daughter. "I have loved you since the second morning you came," he said, "when I watched you sing to my girls in a house that still smelled of my wife's dying, and I understood that you were the bravest, kindest woman I had ever known, grieving as hard as I was and giving anyway. I was only waiting for the courage to say so without it feeling like I was asking you to fill a grave with living love." "You're not asking that," she said. "You're asking me to build something new out of all this sorrow, and I find I want to build it with you more than I've wanted anything since before I learned how much this world could take from a person." They married in the spring, once the snow had gone and the grief, though never fully gone, had softened enough to make room beside it for joy, and Grace and Hope grew up knowing two things as certainly as they knew their own names: that they had been loved fiercely from their very first hungry cry, and that the mother who fed them had chosen them, every single day, long before the law or the church ever made it official. On quiet evenings, Delphine would rock them by the same fire where she had once hummed a nameless tune to a stranger's dying child, and she would think that grief, given somewhere honest to go, did not disappear. It simply learned in time to carry love instead of loss.